Hello, my name is Neil Earnshaw from NEC. Welcome to the NEC for Facilities Management and Maintenance e-learning course. We will explain how you can use the NEC form of contract to fulfill your facilities management and maintenance needs, regardless as to the type of service you are procuring. So, let's have a look at the course programme. Firstly, we'll look at the key principles of NEC contracts. Then, we'll look at the term service contract and term service short contract for facilities management and maintenance, and we'll compare and contrast the two contracts and look at a couple of examples of where they are used. Then we'll look at the contract structure and strategy, and then look at documentation for facilities management and maintenance. Then we'll look at the detailed provisions of the contract. So we'll look at the general provisions, we'll look at roles and responsibilities, we'll look at the plan, then we'll look at how we deal with time, testing and defects, payment, compensation events, and task orders. By the end of this course, delegates should be aware of the wider NEC3 family, understand key principles and how to put them into practice. We should understand how to use the TSC and TSSC for FM and maintenance, know how to prepare and implement contract documents, and understand the key terminology and procedures. Let's look at the key principles. NEC has three main objectives: flexibility, clarity and simplicity, and stimulus to good management. Let's look at each one of these in turn. Firstly, let's look at flexibility. The NEC contracts can be used to procure any works, supplies or services in any sector. They're flexible in that they give you a choice of pricing mechanisms from lump sum at one end of the risk spectrum to cost plus at the other end. There are then a series of bolt-on secondary options that allow an employer to build up a contract to suit his individual needs, and this allows for appropriate allocation of risk. The contracts are also designed for international use. Let's look at clarity and simplicity then. NEC contracts are written in ordinary language. They use minimal legalistic phrases and minimised subjective phrases such as fair, reasonable and opinion. When the contract administrator has to make a decision, the grounds on which that decision is made are stated in the contract, and we have a user-friendly structure as well. Finally, stimulus to good management. The NEC is not a contract designed for the bottom drawer. All the procedures are designed to contribute to effectiveness for all parties. There are clear divisions of roles and responsibilities. We should always have an up-to-date contractor's plan, and there is an early warning process which allows us to have a common sense approach to risk management. So let's briefly look at the wider members of the NEC3 family. There are 12 contracts in the NEC3 family in total that allow an employer to procure works, services and supplies. We're focusing today on the term services contract and the term services short contract. Each contract in the family is supported by its own guidance notes and flowcharts. The main features of the term service contract are: you are given a choice of three payment mechanisms. You can have either a lump sum contract, a target cost contract, or a cost reimbursable contract. We then have a choice of secondary options that allow the contract to be tailored to your individual needs. We use a contractor's plan as the key management tool, and we have the role of service manager who administers the contract on behalf of the employer, and the role of service manager is defined in the contract. There are named key people to represent the contractor. We use it for more complex, higher risk contracts. Now let's look at the main features of the term service short contract. So the short contract has no choice of payment mechanisms. We can either have a lump sum and/or a schedule of rates only. There are no target cost or cost reimbursable options under the short contract. There are also no choice of secondary options. If a contractor's plan is required, the requirements need to be defined in the service information rather than being written into the contract itself. The employer administers the contract unless he appoints an employer's agent, but the role of employer's agent is not defined in the contract. It is defined by the employer dependent on his requirements. There are no named contractor's key people, so we use the term service short contract for less complex, lower risk contracts. So, how do we choose the right contract then? When deciding to use either the TSC or TSSC, we should consider the following factors. Let's look at the size, type and complexity of the estate and assets, the different skills and trades that are required, any future changes to the estate or funding model, the planned length of the contract, our in-house management capacity and capability, but also our attitude to performance management and continuous improvement. Now let's look at the main features of the term service short contract. So the short contract has no choice of payment mechanisms. We can either have a lump sum and/or a schedule of rates only. There are no target cost or cost reimbursable options under the short contract. There are also no choice of secondary options. If a contractor's plan is required, the requirements need to be defined in the service information rather than being written into the contract itself. The employer administers the contract unless he appoints an employer's agent, but the role of employer's agent is not defined in the contract, it is defined by the employer dependent on his requirements. There are no named contractors' key people, so we use the term service short contract for less complex, lower risk contracts. Let's look at the term service contract structure and strategy. We have a modular option structure comprising 5 modules. There are core clauses, then main option clauses, which are referenced A, C or E, that decide the payment mechanism, dispute resolution option clauses, which are referenced W1 or W2, secondary option clauses, which are prefixed with an X or a Y, and any additional clauses, which are all prefixed with a Z. The employer would normally decide the modules he wants in the contract. You always have the core clauses. You choose one main option, one of the dispute resolution options, and then as many or as few secondary options as you want or need, and then choose any additional clauses you want. Firstly, let's look at the core clauses. The core clauses are arranged into 9 sections. Firstly, the general section. Then we have contractor's main responsibilities, time, testing and defects, payment, compensation events, use of equipment, plant and materials, risks and insurance, and termination. There are 3 main options to choose from that decide the payment mechanism. Option A is a price contract with a price list. Option C is a target contract with a price list, and option E is a cost reimbursable contract. Note that in the TSC, options B, D and F are not used. Firstly, let's look at option A, price contract with price list. This is the most traditional form of contract, and we can use this where we have a well-defined service at tender stage. Usually the employer would develop a price list at tender stage and issue it to the tenderers. The price list would then be priced by the contractor at tender stage. The price list can be a combination of lump sums and quantity-related items, and the contractor is paid on the completion of items in the price list. Payment, which is something we refer to as the price for services provided to date, is equal to lump sums for completed items plus any ad-measured items. Note that in the price list, we will treat months as quantity-related items. Now let's look at option C, which is the target contract with price list. The services must be adequately defined to establish the target at tender stage. The target, or prices, are set by the price list which the contractor prices at tender stage. The contractor also tenders 2 types of fee. The target can then move with compensation events and also with the remeasurement of quantity-related items. The contractor, however, is paid defined cost plus fee, and then the contractor is paid or pays a share of the difference between total costs and the final target at dates set out in the contract data. The next slide is a diagram which helps to explain this process. So over at the left-hand side, we have our target, and the target, remember, is set by the price list which was tendered by the contractor at tender stage. Over at the right-hand side of the slide, at dates stated in the contract data, the service manager calculates any pain or gain share due to or from the contractor. Scenario A shows a target that has increased. It has increased because items in the price list have been remeasured, but also we have some compensation events that have occurred. Scenario A shows the defined cost plus fee being less than the target, so a saving has been generated. And it also shows how the saving is shared with the contractor. Remember, the share percentages are stated in the contract data at tender stage, so the employer has predefined how he will share any savings with the contractor. On this slide, it would look like the contractor is being paid approximately 50% of any savings. So the employer's total cost is the defined cost plus fee plus the contractor's element of the share. Scenario B shows the opposite scenario, where defined cost plus fee is greater than the target. In this scenario, the contractor would pay back his element of the overrun. Again, this is all predefined in the contract data at tender stage. Again, it would appear here that the contractor is paying back roughly 50% of the overrun. Target costs can be used as a great way to incentivize outperforming the initial target price. Finally, we have option E, the cost reimbursable contract. We would only use option E when the service is either poorly defined at tender stage or the service is going to be subject to extensive change. Effectively, in this contract, changes or compensation events are irrelevant. The contractor would still tender two types of fee, but the contractor is paid defined cost plus fee. So he has limited financial risk, except that he has tendered his fee percentages at levels that he can make a profit out of. This slide just summarises where most of the financial risk lies in each one of the main options in the term service contract. So if you think about option A, that was the priced contract with price list, most of the financial risk here is borne by the contractor, and the employer has the most certainty about the financial outcome of the contract. At the other side of the spectrum, we have option E, the cost reimbursable contract. Here the employer is taking most of the financial risk, so he has less certainty about the financial outcome of this contract. And option C, the target contract, sits somewhere in the middle of the two, with shared financial risks. And exactly where option C sits would depend on how you set the pain-gain mechanism. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Next, we have the dispute resolution clauses. And the choice here is either W1 or W2. We use W1 where the Housing Grants, Construction and Regeneration Act does not apply to the contract. And we use W2 where the Housing Grants, Construction and Regeneration Act does apply to the contract. Generally speaking, in making a decision between W1 and W2, it is useful to consult a lawyer. Now let's have a look at the secondary option clauses. In total, there are 14 secondary option clauses from which we can choose. The employer can have as many or as few of the secondary options as he sees fit for his contract. Firstly, we have secondary option X1, price adjustment for inflation. When putting together a contract strategy, the employer must decide whether he wants to retain the risk of inflation or whether he wants to pass this risk to the contractor. If he wishes to pass the risk to the contractor, he would include secondary option X1. Secondary option X2, changed in the law, is similar to X1 in that it's a decision about where risk is going to lie in the contract. If the employer wants to retain the risk of changes in the law, then he would not include X2. If he wishes to pass the risk to the contractor, he would include secondary option X2. Next, we have X3, multiple currencies. We use this where the contractor is going to be paid in more than one currency. X4, parent company guarantee. This provides the employer with some additional security should the contractor fail to perform. If that contractor has a parent company, then the guarantee could be called in and the parent company could be asked to perform the contract on their behalf. X5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11 are not used in the term service contract. X12 is the partnering secondary option. This option can be used for partnering between more than two parties working in a particular area or on a particular asset belonging to the employer, involving a number of different NEC contracts. X13, performance bond. This option requires the contractor to provide a bond to secure his performance of the contract. X14, 15 and 16 are not used in the term service contract. X17, low service damages. We can use this option where the contractor may not achieve the standards specified in the service information. It allows for specified damages to be paid by the contractor in the event of his non-performance. X18, limitation of liability. We incorporate this option in circumstances where acceptance of unlimited liability by a contractor is not commercially practicable. X19 provides the employer with the facility to control work on a task-by-task basis. Things like reactive works or emergency works or minor works can be all instructed using X19. Option X20, Key Performance Indicators. KPIs are being increasingly used as a means of improving efficiency and encouraging better performance by contractors with a view to continuous improvement. X20 provides you with a mechanism for having KPIs in a contract but does not prescribe what the KPIs are. Each employer needs to develop these for himself. The next three secondary options are available for use in UK. The first one, YUK1, is a project bank account. YUK2 is the Housing Grants, Construction and Regeneration Act. And YUK3 is the Contracts, Rights of Third Parties Act. Finally, we have option Z. Option Z are any additional conditions of contract. Well, firstly, I'd start by using option C, target cost, because that actively encourages the contractor to work more efficiently, to work smarter, to find better ways of doing things, to outperform the target price. But I don't want the target being beaten through the contractor not doing certain things. So I like the idea of linking that to KPIs. So we get really good levels of performance and savings as well. But I do like the idea of having carrots and sticks in a contract. So I would also include low service damages as well. So possibly looking at response and repair times on reactive works. I would look at using low service damages as a way of incentivising the contractor to achieve any reactive response and repair times that I'd included in the contract. So, as I said, I like a balanced approach that offers incentives and rewards the contractor for a good performance, but also hits him hard if he fails to perform as well. It's more likely for something like that, where it's a fairly simple service that's being provided, it's a fairly low risk kind of service, so it's more likely for that you would probably use the term service short contract. Let's look at what documents we need when putting together a term service contract. We'll be looking at contract data, the prices, by which we mean the price list, service information, and the affected property. Firstly, we have the contract data forms. Contract data takes us from a generic off-the-shelf NEC3 term service contract to a specific term service contract for a particular employer. It comprises two parts. Contract data part 1 is completed by the employer and sent out with invitations to tender. Contract data part 2 is completed by the contractor and returned with his tender. There is a worked example of the contract data forms at Appendix 7 of the guidance notes for the term service contract. Text in bold is completed by the employer. This text is highlighted by way of a shaded circle. There are explanatory notes in the grey shaded boxes at either side of the page to assist you to complete the template. The next important document is the price list. We only use the price list for options A and option C of the term service contract, and the price list can consist of either lump sum items and/or items with quantities and rates. Usually the price list is compiled by the employer but can be done by the contractor. Either way, the contractor always prices the price list at tender stage. If we want to pay the contractor monthly amounts, these monthly payments will be treated in the same way as quantities. There is an example price list at Appendix 6 of the Term Service Contract Guidance Notes. The service information is possibly the most important contract document. Having good quality service information is vital to achieving better outcomes and reducing misunderstandings and disputes. The service information specifies and describes the service that the contractor is required to provide. and it would also state any constraints in terms of how the contractor provides the service. The documents containing service information are identified in Contract Data Part 1, and they may include details of assets within the affected property, access constraints or requirements to the affected property, test and inspection requirements, information on services, equipment and other things supplied by the employer, health and safety requirements, service specifications and drawings. Finally, we have the affected property. This describes areas where the contractor carries out his activities, and it's incorporated by reference to documents listed in the contract data. Note that the affected property cannot be changed by the service manager. However, if any changes do occur, these would be compensation events under the contract. The affected property may include a list of buildings, layout drawings, and maintenance records. So, how do we draft good quality service information? Make it clear, complete and precise. Avoid the use of subjective terms. Use simple language and processes. Use the present tense. Follow the conventions for italicized and capitalized terms. And check standard specifications for consistency with the TSC. Further support can be found in the guide How to Write the TSC Service Information. We'll now have a look at the core clauses in some more detail. Firstly, we'll look at the general provisions. Under Clause 11, we have the identified and defined terms. Identified terms are terms in the contract data which are italicized, whereas the defined terms are all capitalized and listed under Clause 11.2. Let's have a look at a few of the defined terms that are most relevant to users of the term service contract. Firstly, we have the accepted plan. The accepted plan is defined as the plan identified in the contract data or is the latest plan accepted by the service manager. The latest plan accepted by the service manager supersedes previous accepted plans. Secondly, we have the affected property, which is defined as property of the employer or others, which is affected by the work of the contractor or used by the contractor in providing the service and which is identified in the contract data. Then we have defined cost. This is defined as payments by the contractor in providing the service for people who are employed by the contractor, plant and materials, work subcontracted by the contractor, and equipment, less disallowed cost. Then the eighth definition is that of fee. We have two percentages, a direct fee percentage and a subcontract fee percentage. And we are told the fee is the sum of the amounts calculated by applying the subcontracted fee percentage to the defined cost of subcontracted work and the direct fee percentage to the defined cost of other work. The 14th defined term is that of risk register, and it is defined as a register of the risks which are listed in the contract data and the risks which the service manager or the contractor has notified as an early warning matter. It is important at tender stage for the employer to consider all risks that may affect service provision, and there is space in the contract data forms for the employer to state any key risks that he thinks the contractor could help to mitigate. There is also space in the contract data part 2 for the contractor to state any risks that he sees to the contract that he may want to involve the employer in mitigating. Let's now look at the communications section of the contract. Let's look at Clause 13, which deals with communications. The contract requires that all communications must be in a form that can be read, copied and recorded. This deliberately excludes verbal communication and insists that we have a good discipline to contract administration. Clause 13.7 requires that replies to communications are within the period for reply are as stated in the contract. The period for reply, you will notice, is an identified term, which is a period stated in the contract data forms. The purpose of this is to encourage proactive communication between the parties. Clause 13.7 also requires that all notifications are communicated separately. Again, this is about having a good discipline to contract administration. Let's now look at the early warning process. The early warning process is vital to the success of all NEC contracts. There's a requirement for the contractor and service manager to notify each other as soon as they are aware of any matter which could either increase total of the prices, interfere with the timing of the service, or impair the effectiveness of the service. And then, once notified, the service manager has an obligation to enter the early warning matters in the risk register. So, once the early warning matter has been notified and inserted on the risk register, either party may then instruct the other to attend a risk reduction meeting. Those attending the risk reduction meeting cooperate in making and considering proposals to avoid or reduce the risk, seek solutions, deciding actions, updating the risk register. The service manager then revises the risk register to record decisions and issues it to the contractor. The whole purpose of the early warning process is to encourage collaboration, innovation, and the ability to adjust to circumstances during the contract. Let's have a look at the role of the service manager. The term service contract places considerable authority in the hands of the service manager. It is his responsibility to manage the term service contract for the employer, but at the same time, he must be even-handed in matters such as assessing payment. He is the only person who can instruct changes to the service information and is also constrained from acting unreasonably. The TSC gives statements of the basis on which the service manager makes each type of decision. If the service manager is going to reject a submission from the contractor, then he needs to give his reasons for doing so. It is also the service manager's responsibility to check that the contractor complies with the service information. The service manager is required to accept or reject a number of submissions from the contractor. By giving his acceptance, the service manager does not change the contractor's responsibility to provide the service or liability for his plan or design. He merely accepts, he does not approve. The contractor gives the service manager the authority to delegate any actions once he has notified the contractor. On large or complex term service contracts, it may be necessary for a number of the employer's staff to interact with the contractor. The delegation provisions can allow this to happen in accordance with the contract. Most of the actions under the contract are performed on behalf of the employer by the service manager. The employer is limited as to his role in the contract. Under clause 15.1, the employer has to provide the right of access to the affected property. And under 15.2, he also provides any other things the service information states the employer is to provide. This could include, for example, workshops and other facilities, tools, equipment, water and power, etc. Finally, let's look at the role of the contractor. Clause 20 deals with the contractor's main responsibilities. The contractor's main responsibility is to provide the service in accordance with the service information, and in doing so, he must minimise interference to the affected property and the activities taking place in it. There is also an obligation, under clause 24.1, for the contractor to employ each key person stated in the contract data or to employ replacement people accepted by the service manager. Clause 26 in the subcontracting provisions also makes it clear that if the contractor chooses to subcontract any element of the service, he is still responsible for providing the service as if he hadn't. One of the key management tools in the term service contract is the contractor's plan. The plan is a key management tool in the TSC. Whereas the service information tells the contractor what he needs to do and imposes any constraints on him, the plan tells the employer how the contractor is going to do it. If submitted at tender stage, it can be used to evaluate if the contractor fully understands the employer's requirements. It is a key tool to support the efficient mobilisation and ongoing management of the contract. It should be updated to reflect any significant changes in the service being provided. If the service manager is not going to accept the plan, he has to provide his reasons, and these reasons are stated in the contract. The accepted plan is the latest plan accepted by the service manager. The plan includes a whole host of information, all listed under clause 21.2. It includes the order and timing of the work of the employer and others, dates when the contractor will need access to the affected property, acceptances from the employer, and other things to be provided by the employer. He also has to show provisions for time risk allowances, and for each operation a statement of how the contractor plans to do work, identifying principal equipment and resources. As a consequence, it is likely that this plan will be a collection of documents which may include method statements, histograms and bar charts, etc. Let's start to look at the time section of the contract. Clause 30 defines the starting and the service period. It tells the contractor that he doesn't start work until the starting date and provides the service throughout the service period. This allows the contract to be awarded before the service is required to allow for a mobilisation period. You'll note that there are no provisions under the contract for extending the service period. Testing and defects. We're going to focus here on defects. There's an obligation on both the service manager and the contractor to notify the other of defects they find. There is then also an obligation for the contractor to correct defects within a time which minimises the adverse effect on the employer or others. Note that an actual timescale is not stated. If a defect is not corrected within the required time, the service manager has a responsibility to assess cost to the employer of correcting it, and the contractor pays them. It is also important that the employer provides access to correct a defect. Let's move on to looking at payment. Clause 50 deals with assessing the amount due. The service manager is responsible for assessing the amount due at each assessment date, and in doing so must consider any application for payment the contractor has submitted. Once he has made his assessment, the service manager must give the contractor details of this assessment. The amount due is the price for services provided to date, or PSPD, plus or less other amounts, for example, low service damages, KPIs, or maybe the contractor's share. There is a sanction here in the contract that the service manager must retain a quarter of the price for services provided to date if the contractor has not provided a first plan. The purpose of this sanction is to stimulate the contractor in providing a first plan. Assessments are made at the assessment interval until 4 weeks after the end of the service period. So let's have a look at what the price for services provided to date is for each one of the main options. For main option A, the PSPD is the price for each lump sum item in the price list completed, and then quantity multiplied by rate, where a quantity is stated in the price list. Remember, months are treated as quantities. For options C and E, the price for services provided to date is defined cost plus fee. So what is defined cost in options C and E? Defined cost, we are told, includes payments for people who are employed by the contractor, plant and materials, work subcontracted by the contractor, and equipment. Note that any contractor-owned equipment is charged at market rates. And finally, less disallowed cost. Defined cost includes only amounts at open market or competitively tendered prices with deductions for all discounts, rebates and taxes. So the contractor charges the employer the net cost of providing the service. So what is disallowed cost in options C and E? Some examples of disallowed costs are costs that are not justified by the contractor's accounts and records, costs that should not have been paid to a subcontractor or supplier under their terms of contract, costs incurred only because the contractor did not give early warning he should have, and the cost of events which the contract requires the contractor to insure. The full definition of disallowed cost can be found in the contract. It offers the employer some protection from inefficiency on the part of the contractor. Let's now look at the fee. The fee is generally intended to cover the contractor's overheads and profit, insurance premiums and so forth. The fee percentages are tendered by the contractor and stated in Contract Data Part 2. All of the contractor's costs, which are not included in defined cost, are treated as included in the fee, and the fee is calculated by applying subcontracted fee percentage to defined cost of subcontracted work and direct fee percentage to defined cost of other work. It is generally expected that a subcontract fee percentage would be less than a direct fee percentage, as generally speaking, there is less contractor overhead incurred in managing a subcontractor than there is in managing his own resources.
We'll now move on to look at compensation events. In more traditional forms of contract, these were known as variations or variation orders. NEC contracts use the term compensation events, and we will see over the next few slides how the principles and process differ.
Let's look at compensation events. In more traditional forms of contract, these were known as variations or variation orders. NEC contracts use the term compensation events, and we will see over the next few slides how the principles and process differ. Compensation events are defined as events which, if they do not arise from the contractor's fault, entitle the contractor to be compensated for the effect on prices. Where are they stated? Well, there are 14 stated in subclause 60.1, also in secondary options X2, X12, X19 and Y2.4. It is possible that you could have additional compensation events in secondary option Z as well. As mentioned on the last slide, there are 14 compensation events listed in the core clauses at 60.1. Here are some examples. The first one is the service manager gives an instruction changing the service information. The second, third and fifth compensation events all refer to the employer failing to do something he should have by the time he should have. The second one is his failure to provide the right of access. The third one is his failure to provide something as stated in the service information. And the fifth one is himself or others not working in accordance with the accepted plan. Note that all three of these compensation events refer to the employer's failure to do something in accordance with the accepted plan. The fourth compensation event is the service manager giving an instruction to stop or not to start any work. The fifth compensation event also means the employer takes some liability for others in that it says the employer or others do not work in accordance with the accepted plan. And the 10th compensation event is a change to the affected property other than a change as a result of providing the service. We've looked at the compensation events themselves. Let's now look at the process. We have a defined process to agree or impose the effects of a compensation event within defined time limits. The first stage of the process is notification, then we move into quotation, assessment, and finally implementation. Either party can make sure that the process and timescales are adhered to. The first stage of the process is notification. If the compensation event arises from the service manager giving an instruction, changing a decision, correcting an assumption, then the service manager notifies and instructs the contractor to provide a quotation. For all other compensation events, it is the contractor's obligation to notify. The contractor has up to 8 weeks to notify of the compensation event unless it was due to an instruction of the service manager. This is what is called an 8-week time bar. So let's look at the overall process and timescales for notification of a compensation event and the submission and acceptance of a quotation. So firstly, if the service manager notifies of a compensation event, he should notify the contractor and instruct him to provide a quotation. If the effects of the compensation event are too uncertain, the service manager must state assumptions on which the compensation event is to be priced based on. Once the contractor has the notification, he has up to 3 weeks to submit a quotation, and in that quotation he must include details of his assessment. An alternative start to the process is where the contractor notifies of a compensation event, and the contractor has up to 8 weeks of becoming aware of an event to notify of it. Once he's notified the service manager has 1 week to reply, and that reply must be either accept or reject. If the service manager is accepting the quotation, he accepts it and instructs the contractor to provide a quotation. If he is rejecting, he is tied to 4 grounds for rejecting the compensation event. They are, he's rejecting because it arises from the fault of the contractor, or it's an event that hasn't happened and won't happen, if there is no effect on defined cost, or it is not one of the listed compensation events. And if the service manager is rejecting, then the prices are not changed. So we end up in the quotation stage. As I said previously, if the service manager is instructing a quotation, if the effects of the event are too uncertain, then the service manager has to state assumptions on which the quotation is to be provided on. The contractor has up to 3 weeks to submit the compensation event quotation, and alongside the quotation he must provide details of how he's arrived at his assessment. Once the contractor has submitted his quotation, the service manager has up to 2 weeks to reply to it. His reply must be either asking the contractor to submit a revised quotation, or he can accept the quotation. Alternatively, he can tell the contractor that he does not agree with the quotation and notify him that he's going to be making his own assessment. If making his own assessment, the service manager must provide details when he notifies the contractor that he's going to do so. Going back in the process a couple of steps, the contractor had to submit quotations within 3 weeks. If the contractor had failed in his obligation to do so, then it's the service manager's responsibility to make the assessment and notify the contractor again within 3 weeks. The compensation event process is designed so that we always have an outcome. Is there a compensation event, yes or no? How much is the price going to be changed as a result of the compensation event? Compensation event assessments. Compensation events are assessed as changes to the prices. If a compensation event only affects quantities of work shown in the price list, we can use appropriate rates in the price list. However, for all other compensation events, we use defined cost of work already done, forecast defined cost of work not yet done, and the resulting fee. Once we have made an assessment, it is not revised if a forecast is later shown to be wrong.
In this section, we've looked at the compensation event process and timescales. We'll now move on to look at one of the most popular secondary options, X19 task orders.
Task orders. Secondary option X19 is a popular secondary option and is used with most term service contracts. It is a process for instructing reactive, small or minor works, small projects within the overall service. It is not suitable for instructing significant construction work. Use of the engineering and construction contract or engineering and construction short contract would be more appropriate. The service is in the contract at the beginning. There is no need to instruct this, it just happens. There is a requirement for the service manager to consult with the contractor about the task before issuing the task order. The service manager consults with the contractor about the task before issuing the task order. The purpose of this is so the scope of the task order can be clarified, so that any timescales can be agreed, and so that a price can be discussed. The task order includes a detailed description of the work, a price list of items in the task in which items from the price list are identified, the starting and completion dates for the task, the amount of any delay damages for late completion of the task if required, and a total of the prices for the task. The contractor is required to submit a detailed programme for the task order. Let's have a look at a worked example of a task order. The scenario is that the service is cleaning a hospital estate, which includes routine cleaning and deep cleaning on an ad hoc basis. The service information states the frequencies that cleaning is required, the regime to be followed and the standards to be achieved, etc. The affected property states the areas and locations that are to be cleaned. There is no need to instruct the routine cleaning, this just happens from the starting date. However, when the service manager requires a deep clean, he would instruct this as a task order. If the employer's estate changes, i.e. a new building is added or an old building demolished, this would be dealt with as a compensation event and not a task order.
To summarise then, hopefully you've seen how NEC contracts can be used as a key enabler to improving outcomes on facilities management and maintenance contracts. The NEC is flexible enough to be used for all aspects of facilities management and maintenance. It is simple and written in plain English that encourages people to engage with it. It is flexible in how it can be used and what it can be used for, and encourages and enables good management. The general NEC principles apply to both the term service contract and the term service contract, and fundamentally it is an easy contract to put together. Thank you for participating in this e-learning course. I hope you have found it beneficial, and I wish you every success in the future.